Hey, Grey Ghost friends! It is back at Grey Ghost Sip Trips. We're on episode 3. Just seeing if we got anybody checking in. And when you get on, let us know if that mic is working fabulously, if you can hear us okay. We are so excited to have you here today. We're up to 1,000 people. Now 3,000. Hi, Diane. Good to see you. 8,000. John Andrews is checking in. Everybody's pretty excited because tonight we're talking a little bit of Reserve Cabernet. We got Karen on. She says okay, so I'm thinking she can hear. Matthew Perry says he can hear great, so I am turning it over to the stars of our show, Al and Cheryl.
Amy, are we on now? We're on?
Yes,
Okay.
we're on.
Well, again, it's great to have you back with our third in the series of Sip Trips. This is really an exciting one for us. If you remember, the first one was looking at the beginning of winemaking, where Cheryl and I actually took you out to the vineyard and showed you how the wine grapes were actually developing and growing. After that, we went to the end of winemaking, where we looked at bottling last week. Now we're going to have a quick change of pace and focus more on wine enjoyment and vintage comparison. But before we do that, I think I better pass on a real quick piece of information. Apparently there was a private plane with Mike Tyson, Bill Gates, the Dalai Lama, and a hippie that were flying, and they were having trouble on the plane. And the pilot came across the air and said, "I'm afraid we're going down. There's parachutes in the back. I wish you the best." And he jumped out. Well, of course, immediately Mike Tyson jumped up, grabbed one of the parachutes and said, "There's only 3. But since I'm the world's greatest boxer, I think I deserve one." So he jumped out of the plane with the parachute. Immediately, Bill Gates jumped up and said, "I'm the world's smartest man, and if anything, I should deserve a parachute." He too grabbed one and jumped out. The Dalai Lama very gently looked over at the hippie and said, "I'll tell you what, I've lived a wonderful full life. Why don't you take the last parachute and I'll go down with the plane?" The hippie looked at him and said, "I don't think we have to worry about that. The smartest man in the world just jumped out with my backpack."
Bada bing!
With that, now we can talk a little bit about our featured wine. Tonight, we're going to be dealing with the Reserve Cabernet 2016. This is one of the wines that's going to be poured at the vertical, which we're also going to be talking about very shortly. A little bit about reserves at Grey Ghost. To begin with, we only produce a Reserve Cabernet on years that we consider exceptional. I've often referred to them as a California summer. Dry, hot, the type of a summer that you just pray for as a winemaker. We use the oldest vines on the property. As all of you have come onto the property at least 1 or 2 times, I'm sure, you've seen the old Cabernets that are on in front. That's where the fruit comes from for our Reserve Cabernet. They're all small lot fermented, and of course, before I talk anymore, it's very important to pour them. By the way, remember, we're still in a crisis mode, COVID-19, so we're encouraging two-handed drinking. And Cheryl is going to demonstrate that. Now, going back to description, as I mentioned, these are small lot fermented. When fermentation is completed, the wines are put through the press, but they're not pressed. It's the free run that we use for our Reserve Cabernet. Anytime you see the word reserve on one of our bottles, it indicates that the wine was either fermented and or aged in new French barrels. Therefore, that's what basically happens on the Reserve Cabernet. It's the only red that we run through malolactic. ML is a secondary fermentation designed to soften the acids and give these wines just a real velvety finish. From there, they stay in oak for 3 years, or pretty close to 3 years. Once the wine has been aged It then comes out of the barrel unfiltered. We actually remove this wine top down, which means it's siphoned out of the barrel from the top, leaving any sediment that may have accumulated in the barrel, effectively letting the barrel find the wine. We then bottle it and use only natural cork. Natural cork is what we use across the board for all of our wines. This gives us the ability to age this wine over time. So with that, here's to the 2016 Reserve Cabernet. Damn, that's a good wine.
It's excellent.
Whoa. Yes.
We have a question from the producer. How does this wine compare against other wines around the world?
I'm glad the producer asked this question. I should note that in the International Wine Women's Competition held in California, where only women judged this wine, it took a 93-point gold. So here's to all you wonderful women out there. Should also mention that in the California competition, East meets West, where East Coast wines were basically put up against the West Coast wines, it took a 90-point gold against the California wines, giving you some indication of how we're matching up in the category of the Cabernets. I also should point out that this, over time, has collected a total of 13 medals. So does that answer your question, Amy?
Yes, thank you so much.
You're more than welcome. Now I think it's time for us to take a real quick break and ask Cheryl to update us on her exciting week that's transpired, the third week of Sip Trip. Well, that pretty much sums up Cheryl's life during the past week. Thank you again for bringing us up to date. Before we get into the major segment of this presentation or this show, I wanted to update you a little bit on what's happening in the vineyard. This past week, was the last week for our summer help. We had probably one of the best staffs we've ever had this year. We've actually looked forward to having them in and working with us, and they've done a marvelous job. We also laid the chicken wire out to protect us against the deer. So that's now been done throughout the vineyard. Finally, the first samples of grapes were taken. It was the Sauvignon Blanc. They're running considerably behind what we were getting last year. On Monday, I'll be running tests again on the Sauvignon and adding the Gewürztraminer, and it should give us a better feel for how fast the grapes are ripening and what we should look for down the road as far as harvest is concerned. Should also mention sprays are now completed. The next spray will be the last spray, which we call post-harvest, and that's what gives the vine its final protection going into the winter. Do we have any questions right now?
Yes, Sherry was asking if we still have room in our volunteer harvest program this fall.
Yes, we do. And it's very important that we're running out of time for signing up. If you're interested, do get in and get signed up. We'd love to have you. I will mention that a special email will be going out to any of you who sign up now. Those of you who have already signed up have received it, letting you know what the protocol will be to make sure that everybody who does come will be comfortable.
Chris and Sally Christopher were very sweet to notice and ask, why doesn't the producer have a glass tonight?
Very good question. She's sitting way too far from us, so I'm terribly sorry. She's going to have to consume later on in the evening, but I assure you we will take care of her, Sally. I assure you we will. Now, the main feature for tonight, as I mentioned earlier on, was wine comparison and wine enjoyment. I don't know if you've noticed, but the environment we're sitting in right now is part of what's going to take place tonight, and that's the vertical wine tasting in which 10 Reserve Cabernets are going to be poured. All but one is coming out of the library. A couple of them are still on the market. Now, what's the definition of a vertical? A vertical is when you take the same wine from the same vineyard, but from different vintages, tasting one against the other. What we're basically doing on tonight's program is doing two flights. A flight of 5 wines that preceded the 2011 vintage and 5 wines that were immediately after the 2011. I think many of you are questioning why 2011. It was a natural break. For those of you who remember, it was a wet year, and Cheryl and I made the decision early on that although the wines were beautiful in 2011, they didn't have the character that we really wanted. Therefore, what was going to be reserved for the 2011 was incorporated in our regular Cabernets. What we basically do in the flights are pour and encourage the consumers, those participating, to consume the youngest wines first, moving over to the oldest. Why do we do this? Well, it's maturity. These wines have been aged in a perfect environment, and therefore over time they develop a soft finish as the tannins begin to fall out and actually soften. So what the individuals are going to be doing is tasting from the youngest to the oldest. All of these 10 wines were produced in exactly the same manner. And I think if you remember, I was describing how the 2016 was produced. That's the way we operate on all of these wines. The only variable then is the growing season and the vintage, and of course the aging. So this is going to give everyone, including Cheryl and me, and I might also mention Amy, a chance to do a comparison of aromas, of colors, of the fruit character of these wines, knowing that every single wine was produced exactly the same. Now the next question people say, and often ask us, is if you're tasting these wines, how do you taste? How do you gain the greatest appreciation for the wine? Well, what I'm going to do is take you through a tasting, and I'm going to take you through what I call tasting by the essence. You'll notice on the table, every single glass has a stem. Our wine glasses have a stem for a reason. When I'm pouring, or when we're pouring these wines, we're pouring these wines at the appropriate temperature. So we encourage the participants to use the glass by holding it on the stem. Now you can imagine these are very, very sophisticated people we're having tonight. So we allow them to put their little fingers out, showing their sophistication. The only time we tell people that they can touch the bowl, periodically a wine actually may be too cold. Then it's a matter of cupping it, and that's putting it between the palm of your hand, gently warming the wine up, and then you're ready to taste again. But otherwise, we're going to hang on to the stem. The next item, of course, is sight. You always want to look at the wine, but you want to look at it under very specific lighting. The lighting we have in here is incandescent. There's only 3 lighting sources you're going to ever use: candlelight, incandescent lighting, and sunlight. It's the only light that contains all the colors of the visible spectrum. Any other lighting is going to wash the wine out or discolor it. When I'm looking at a white, I'm looking for clarity, and it should sparkle like a liquid diamond. If it's done in stainless steel, it's often going to take on a straw color. If it's done in oak, many times it's going to absorb some of the color from the barrel, thus giving it a little more of a yellowish tone. Reds, I look for clarity, but I also look for color. There's 3 colors that I'm always looking for in a red wine. If it's purplish in color, chances are it's a very young wine. If it's ruby, we're looking at a very mature wine. If the wine is taking on a browning tint, that wine is starting to go over the hill, kind of like me. So keep that in mind. Those are the 3 that we're looking for. Now the next step is to smell. Smell, then we're going to swirl, and then we're going to smell again. Now why do it twice? Well, the first time we're smelling, we're merely looking for flaws. If it smells like dirty gym socks, burnt rubber tires, turpentine, Band-Aids, asparagus, chances are we have a flawed wine. That's the wine you send back at the restaurant. Once we get past that, the swirling has merely filled the bowl with the aromatic compounds of the grape, now converted to wine. And you're going to be shocked at how intense that second smell is. Finally, we're ready to taste. 95% of our taste is actually from your nose. Your tongue is not detecting flavor. Your tongue is strictly there to pick up astringency, bitterness, sourness, sweetness, saltiness, but no flavor. So what we want to do is couple these two senses together. And to do this, we're going to sip, slurp, and splash. You're going to sip wine into your mouth, slurp air over the top, keeping in mind we have liquid in our mouth. So you don't look up, you look down. If you look up, you're going to open up your windpipe, and we're going to have a lot less people for segment 4 of Sip Trip. So to accomplish this, this is what you're going to try to do. I love this job, trust me. Finally, the last S is spit or swallow. I think you can tell by now that at Grey Ghost we look at spitting as alcohol abuse, and therefore you won't see that here. So those are the S's that you're going to want to remember. It's the stem of the glass, sight, smell, swirl and spell, sip, slurp, and splash, and last but not least, swallow. Any questions about what we've seen so far?
Yes. So what I'm going to start with Sherry, who asked, do you look for a brick color in a older red?
Very good question, yes. Oftentimes it will take on more of a brick color, and that is an indication that that wine should be consumed. You don't want to age that wine much longer.
Before we go back into tonight's segment, there was a question Matthew asked, will we be considering Friday harvests?
Matthew, very possibly. Some of the harvests are going to be much smaller than they have been in the past, and also a chance that we may be able to harvest on a couple of days for the same grape. If that's the case, Friday harvest followed by a Saturday harvest would be a possibility. Of course, we'll keep you posted on that. One thing that does do for us is it reduces the number of people that we have at a particular harvest, which also gives us a little more flexibility as far as social distancing. But that's a very good question.
Larry Pryluck from the budding metropolis of Amosville writes, we have a nice collection of Grey Ghost holiday and Cabernet and chocolate glasses of various shapes and sizes. Please discuss which shape works best for which variety.
Normally, a bowl-shaped glass is designed to concentrate the aromas as you're swirling. So what we often do, we'll use the large bowl glass as a way of enjoying a really full-bodied red. The glasses that I have, and that Cheryl and I are using right now, are designed both for red and for white. A white doesn't necessarily have to have the concentration, since you're oftentimes looking more for a fruitier style characteristic as compared to those dynamic aromas that you pick up in a red. If you remember, there's a very small glass that we use for our adieu. The adieu glass is really designed because normally when you're drinking a dessert, you're using a very small amount in a smaller glass. So you would basically lose the concentration. Therefore, the smaller the glass, the better for a late harvest wine or a dessert wine.
Stacy Tiley, who is here with us in spirit, asks a very good question. She's our science girl. How do you differentiate between brick and brown in an older red?
Stacy, basically we're talking the same thing. The only difference is a brick normally concentrates throughout the entire glass. Browning will often show up when you tip the glass and you see the browning on the edge of the bottle of the glass. Brick also takes on more of a deep, hard red as compared to a browning color. So they can often be interchanged. Quite frankly, when you're tasting an older red, if it comes across as a little more raisiny in character, chances are it's reaching or past its maturity.
I just want Teresa to know how much I am laughing behind the screen at her comment that the bottle works great also.
Very, very good. Well, I think what we've basically done is had a chance to go through a little bit of the enjoyment that's going to be taking place tonight. We're terribly sorry for those of you who cannot participate being with us that we had to move it inside. We do have rain here right now, and that was what we were so fearful of, and that's why we had to move it in. Yes, Amy?
We have one more question from Sherry. Have you ever lost a harvest/bottled year, ouch, due to corking, etc.?
One year, the only year that we produced a wine that we were not comfortable with was 1994. We opened the winery with the 93 vintage, probably one of the greatest vintages Virginia ever had. 94 was just the opposite. We had 28 days of consecutive rain. As a result, the fruit came in terribly. Cheryl and I had made a commitment early on that we were not going to release a wine that we were not proud of and would want to have the consumer enjoy. So we opted not to release a portion of the Cabernet. The problem we had was, how do you get rid of almost 500 gallons of wine? We got in touch with the at that time it was ATF, now it's the TTB, to ask them about dumping it. We had to get government permission. We were informed that wine is considered a hazardous material, and therefore it would have to be trucked down to a hazardous material landfill in Richmond in order to get rid of it. However, we were very fortunate to have an incredible agent, and she said, have you ever thought of selling it to somebody who makes brandy or distilled spirits? And she hooked us up with one that was located in Culpeper. So we were able to take 500 gallons of Cabernet Sauvignon down to a distiller and sell it to them, granted at a reduced price considerably, but at least it went to a good home. Otherwise, we would have had to pay for it. So to answer your question, yes, we did have one period of time, and also it gave us a chance to learn a little bit about vineyard management. Since then, we've had years that were wet, but we've never had a problem in the vineyard because of the way we manage the fruit. Now, I think it's time for those of you who want that last spot of coffee to tell you one more quick story, and that deals with a young lady who went to a store to get a very high-tech coffee pot, high-tech maker. The salesman explained to her how to plug it in, to fill it, to set the timer, so she'll be able to wake up and have a fresh cup of coffee when she wanted it. About 3 weeks later, she showed back up at the shop, and the gentleman, the salesman, went up and said, so how's the coffee maker? She said, oh, it's just wonderful. I just have one question. Why is it that I have to go to bed every time I want a cup of coffee? With that, once again, thank you so much for joining us. We're looking forward to seeing you all. Again, this is the end of section 3. We'll look forward to seeing you next week for Zip Trip section 4.
Thank you for tuning in tonight. Next week we'll be featuring the Victorian White, and this has been season 2 of Happy Half Hour, episode 3. Sip Trips. Oh, that is a mouthful, you crazy kids. And we're looking forward to those of you who are joining us tonight for the Vertical Cabernet Sauvignon. Thank you.